It's my privilege this morning to introduce to you our keynote speaker. And whenever you have the opportunity to introduce someone, especially someone who carries a title or a rank, you always want to make sure that you don't get that wrong. You want to make sure that you have that exactly right. I did a funeral last week and introduced our governor, introduced the adjutant general, and introduced the Wisconsin State Patrol superintendent, and the attorney general of our state was there, and I got them all right, and that was the greatest relief for me to have it done. And so I wanted to make sure, absolutely certain, I didn't demote General Richardson this morning. And then I looked at our program and realized we already had, so I don't have to be concerned about it. I just want you to be assured when you read the insert in your bulletin, he is not Major Richardson, but it's actually still Major General Cecil Richardson. I had the opportunity to meet General Richardson first last night, and we corresponded on the telephone as we were arranging his attendance and his participation today. But last night, he and his wife Jan attended our Wednesday night worship service. And with the few minutes that we had in my office prior to that service, I met a humble man. I met a genuine man. I met a servant, truly a servant of servants. You can read most of what I'll share in his introduction along with me if you care to. But Major General Cecil Richardson was Chief of Chaplains, headquartered in the United States Air Force portion of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and as a member of special staff of the Chief of Staff, established guidance and provided advice on all matters pertaining to religious and moral welfare for Air Force personnel. He was responsible for establishing an effective chaplain program to meet the religious needs of all members of the United States Air Force and their dependents. As Chief of Chaplains, he was senior pastor of a modest congregation of 800,000. Active duty, Guard, Reserve, and civilian forces serving in the United States and overseas. He led an Air Force chaplain corps of approximately 2,200 chaplains and chaplains' assistants from the active and Air Force Reserve components. And as chairman of Air Force chaplains boards, advised the Secretary of Defense and Joint Chiefs of Staff on religious, ethical, and quality of life concerns. Chaplain Richardson began his career as an enlisted intercept operator and Russian interpreter, served 2 assignments as senior Protestant chaplain and 2 as a wing chaplain, has also served as chaplain assignment officers, Major Command Division Chief. His senior leadership positions include Executive Director, Armed Forces Chaplain Board, Command Chaplain for U.S. Central Command and Air Combat Command, and Commandant, U.S. Air Force Chaplains Corps College. Having traveled to over 130 nations of our world, now here with us this morning at our Coulee Region Mayoral Prayer Breakfast, would you please welcome with me to speak to us today, Major General Cecil Richardson.
Somebody say hooah. Good morning and God bless you all. Let me begin by saying thank you. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you stand for. Thank you for what you do and have done for your community and for our country. And thank you most of all for the faith that brought you to this prayer breakfast this morning. Did you hear the one about the rabbi and the priest and the 2 Protestant pastors who went for a cruise late one night? Well, I hope you have. Because it's one of the most powerful and inspiring true stories in the history of our nation. It was February 3rd, 1943. The ship was the USS Dorchester. There were 907 souls aboard. They were heading to Thule, Greenland to do their part in World War II. They had been warned to always wear their life vests because there were German subs in the area and they were fearing torpedoes. But the Dorchester was fairly small, and with over 900 men into the little hold of the ship trying to sleep, it was terribly hot because of all the body heat, and it was terribly cramped. And so most of the men, in order to sleep, took off their life vests and took off their boots. Well, on the 3rd of February, At about 2 a.m. in the morning, 1943, a torpedo hit the Dorchester, followed in rapid succession by another torpedo, and the ship began to sink very, very rapidly. The captain gave the abandon ship order, and the men came flooding up out of the hold, most of them without a life vest. There were 4 chaplains aboard, a rabbi, a priest, and 2 Protestant pastors. They took over. They grabbed axes and they chopped down the doors to the ship's stores, and they grabbed all the extra life vests and they threw them to men saying, "Jump, jump, save your life, jump overboard with this vest, jump." But after a while, there were no more vests. And one by one, the chaplains took off their own vest and handed it to a soldier and said, "Jump and save your life." And as the men bobbed up and down in the water that night, that moonlit night, some in lifeboats, many of them just floating with their vest in the water, they saw the boat like this. The boat had lights around the side of it. They saw the boat like this, and suddenly the boat went like that. And then they witnessed the most remarkable event, something they talked about and wrote about for the rest of their lives. In fact, I interviewed several of them. They said that the 4 chaplains linked arms and worked their way up to the bow of the boat. They stood on the bow of the overturned boat, and they shouted out to the men in the water, "Don't give up. Trust in God. Pray. Keep your faith. Hold on. Hope is coming. Help is coming. A ship is coming. Hold on. Pray. Don't give up." And then one by one, the 4 chaplains prayed for the men in the water and their families. And then the 4 chaplains held hands together on the bow of that ship, and they started singing a hymn together. And as they sang, the ship went down, and the 4 chaplains gave their lives for their country and for their men. If anyone ever asked you what a chaplain is, tell them about the priest and the rabbi and the 2 Protestant ministers who went out for a cruise. I know I look far too young, but I spent 41 and a half years in the military. 6 years enlisted, 35 and a half as a chaplain. I've walked on our nation's battlefields. I've stood in bombed out buildings with my uniform saturated with blood. I've carried human remains in my hat, and I've held the hands of brave Americans who were breathing their last and going to be with God. I've sat by the hospital beds of some of the greatest heroes our nation has ever known, and far too many times I've stood at Arlington National Cemetery, and I've rendered a final salute to those who had given their all in service to our country. And yet, after all these years, every time I stand at a ceremony, every time I face our flag and hear the strains of our national anthem, every time I place my hand on my heart or I render a salute, something happens deep within me. And I realize once again what a privilege it is to be an American. What an honor it is to have worn a military uniform. What a blessing it is to be able to say, I'm a chaplain. But I wasn't born a chaplain. Most of the ministers here were born with a communion cup in one hand and a Bible in the other, but I wasn't. Not at all. The day I graduated from high school, I tucked $3 in my pocket. I was down in Richardson County, Wisconsin. I walked to the top of our driveway, I stuck out my thumb, and I began life on my own. After a few hours of walking and hitchhiking, I caught a ride with an elderly couple who told me they were going to Rockford, Illinois. And I said, "Oh, that's where I'm going." Well, actually, I had never heard of Rockford, Illinois, but I figured that's where my life would begin. And when I finally got to Rockford, I wandered the streets and I slept under trees and on park benches. And I finally landed a job at J.I.K.'s Tractor Company. If you know Rockford, it was on State Street off Route 20. It was a factory. And it was there that a major chapter in my life's education began. The job was hard and the pay was pitiful, but the people were fascinating. Most of them had very little education. Some of them couldn't read or write. Few of them had any hopes of ever progressing in life. They acted as though they were trapped in the factory with no chance of ever escaping the back-breaking work and the low wages. And the truth is, my friends, I fit right in with them. I had no vision, I had no ambition, I had no hope of ever bettering myself. I had been a good student in high school, I'd worked my way through, and more than anything, I wanted to go to college, but I was a poor kid from a poor family, and there was just no chance I could go to college. So I resigned myself to working in a factory for the rest of my life. And then 8 months later, while I was still 18 years old, I got a letter from my uncle, Uncle Sam. He was having a little war in Vietnam, and he wanted me to come join him. My friends and I were all 18 years old when we got that letter. We didn't know anything about the military. We didn't know what was in store for us, but we knew we lived in a great country. And we knew that if our country needed us, then we should respond and we should go. And so we committed ourselves to either enlisting or to letting ourselves being drafted. But there was one guy in our group, a guy named Denny. Denny was afraid of the draft. He didn't want to enlist. He didn't want to leave home. But instead of burning his draft card or running away to Canada like so many did in those days, Denny took a shotgun and he walked out behind his house into the woods. And then he laid the shotgun on his foot and he blew his foot off. He didn't want to get drafted, and he didn't get drafted. He didn't want to pass the physical, and he didn't pass the physical. He didn't want to serve in the military, and Denny has never served his country one day in his life. But I submitted to you this morning that Denny lost more than a foot that day. For Denny has never known the pride of wearing a military uniform. He has never looked in a mirror and counted the stripes on his sleeve or polished the brass on his shoulder. Denny has never known the feeling you get when you hear the national anthem and you stand and you salute and you watch our flag waving across a brilliant blue sky. He's never known that feeling. He's never known what it's like to be a part of a band of brothers and sisters who more than self, their country love and mercy more than life. Today, my friend Denny works as a high school in southern Wisconsin, and as a high school janitor, and he limps through the hallways on an artificial foot. I'm not angry with Denny for what he did. He's still my friend. I hold no animosity for the fact that I was drafted and he wasn't. Denny was just a young kid who did something really stupid because he got scared. But I want to tell you this morning that I will never, ever, ever regret joining the United States military. For it was in the military that I learned discipline. It was in the military that I learned things like duty and honor and courage and sacrifice. It was in the military that I learned that every American can have a chance. And best of all, this is where I'm getting, so listen now. Best of all, it was in the military that I first heard the gospel of Jesus Christ. It was as a two-striper airman in the military that I fell on my knees and asked the Lord in my heart. It wasn't planned. I was just trying to meet girls. I had never been in a church in my whole life. Never. I was a horrible, horrible military person. I was in one fight after another. I had thrown one guy out a third-floor window, and the only thing that kept me out of jail was the fact that he was a bigger criminal than I was. I had gotten in another fight in the barracks and ironed a guy with a hot iron. I was not a candidate for Airman or Soldier of the Year, not at all. But one day, I have a gift for languages, still do. And I'd gone to Syracuse University, and then they sent me to San Angelo, Texas, to go through a school to be able to listen in on the Russians, what we're accusing them of doing to us. So I was doing to them all those years ago. And while I was at this school, I thought, well, I want to meet some girls. But I wasn't very good at it. I tried bars and parties and all the things you do, and finally the thought came to me, why don't you go to a church? Well, I'd never been to church. I didn't know anything about it, but if you know San Angelo, Texas, there are churches everywhere. And I figured, well, there's probably girls in the church. So I walked off base, and I saw a church, and I'll never forget, I started going up the stairs, and the thought came to me, Cecil, they probably charge at the door. You know, if you've never been to church, you don't know what it's like. And I thought it was probably like the movies where they charge you $5 to get in. So, true story, I sneaked around the back. And I sneaked in the back of the church. I was a church crasher. And I got in there and I was looking around, there were some beautiful girls there, But there was this old white-haired guy up front talking. It turned out he had been a missionary to India for 28 years. And the more he talked, the more I listened. And as he talked, something happened to 20-year-old Cecil Richardson. And I thought, boy, if what he's saying is true, then I better turn my life around. And then he gave what I now know as an altar call. At the time, I didn't know what was going on. It's like Billy Graham does. He said, come forward, And I didn't want to. I thought, if I go forward, the girls will never like me. I mean, they'll know how bad I am, and that's the end of that. But then I thought, I don't care. I want to go forward and get my heart right with God. And so remember, I was a rough guy. There was an old lady to the left of me. And I pushed her. I said, get out of my way. I did. I pushed her. And I rushed down to the altar. And I fell on my knees. And I said, Lord, come into my life. And I don't remember all that because I didn't know anything about praying. But I did what they told me to do. And it changed my life. There at the altar of God in San Angelo, Texas, I found answers to the questions that only God can answer. Answers that I've needed throughout my life. I'm talking about questions like, who am I, and why am I here, and what's the meaning of life, and is there anything worth living for? And more important than that, for a military person or for the police or for first responders, is there anything at all worth dying for? A few years ago, a group of terrorists detonated a truck bomb in front of the American embassy in Nairobi. There were over 1,000 wounded and hundreds were killed. I was the chaplain for that embassy. I was there when it happened. I can't go into all that transpired that day. It would be too emotional for me to tell and too emotional for you to hear, and that's not the focus of my talk. I only bring it up to mention that those of us who have served in the military or have served in some way as first responders, those of us who have known war up close and personal, those of us who have witnessed death and witnessed terrorism and witnessed unspeakable human suffering, we've had plenty of occasion to ask ourselves if there's anything worth fighting for. We've had plenty of occasion to ask ourselves if are there any values at all that absolutely must be defended. We've had plenty of occasion to ponder the question, is there anything at all worth dying for? Let me say to you this morning that if there's nothing worth dying for, then there's nothing worth living for either. You can never live, really live, until you love something or someone so much that you would be willing to die for them or die for it. I'm talking about the big things like your family, your faith, your friends, your freedom, your country. And those of us who have served in the military have also had plenty of occasion to ask ourselves the very question that some of you are asking yourself this morning: does God really answer prayer? There are a lot of people who believe in prayer, a lot of people, but there aren't that many people who believe in answers. Let me tell you this morning, I've learned in my ministry, I've been shot at, I've been attacked in every single way you could think of. I have learned that God does answer prayer. Let me tell you one little story and then I'll close. Several years ago, while I was still at the Pentagon, not that long ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, about halfway through my Pentagon time, I woke up in the morning at 5:30 on a Saturday morning. I sat up in bed and I turned to Jan and said, Jan, I have to go get glasses. Now, my wife, Jan, is a normal person. So she answered the way a normal person would. She said, it's 5:30 in the morning and you've needed glasses for years. Why now? Nevertheless, being the wonderful person that she is, she got up with me and we got cleaned up and we went out driving around the area. And finally, by 6:30, we had found an optical shop. Now, this will shock you, I know, but did you know that optical shops aren't open at 6:30 on Saturday morning? So we went to Denny's and we had breakfast and we read the newspaper and we compared our calendars. We both travel a lot. And after that, we went to garage sales, one garage sale after another. But right at 9 o'clock, right when the lady with all the keys comes from the inside of the shop and opens up the doors, we were standing outside the door waiting to go look at glasses. So we went in and we sat down and the lady started showing us different kind of frames. And I had this feeling, more than a feeling, I had this compulsion to tell her that I was a chaplain. At the same time, I didn't want to tell her. I was afraid she would think I was asking for a discount. I'm a chaplain, can I have 10% off? So I didn't say anything at all. And she got up and went to the back of the store to talk to her friend. And I turned to Jan and I said, Jan, should I tell her that I'm a chaplain? And Jan said, well, what difference does that make? You're buying glasses. So the lady comes back out and she sits down and starts talking to us about the benefits of no-line bifocals. And after a while, not exaggerating, I couldn't stand it anymore. I couldn't stand it. And this is exactly what I did. I just threw my hands. I went like this. I'm a chaplain. and her body began to quiver, and her eyes filled with tears. When she was able to speak, she said something that changed my life forever. She said, "My husband's in the military, and I have cancer. And just before you came in this morning, my friend and I were in the back of the store, and we prayed that God would send me a military chaplain that I could talk to." And right there in the optical shop at a little bit after 9 on a Saturday morning, Jan and I held hands with a beautiful young woman whose life was threatened by cancer, and we told her about the God who loves her and the God who answers prayer. Does God answer prayer? You bet your bifocals God answers prayer. I don't know what kind of circumstance you're going through this morning. Some of you might be tempted to give up. Some of you might be in a position where you're thinking that I'm so stressed out and the whole world doesn't know a thing about it. They don't care. It might seem to some of you that God's answering machine is broken and his cell phone is out of order. It might seem that God doesn't have a clue who you are or what you're going through. But friends, don't you believe that, because that's not true. God knows you. He knows you. He knows what you're going through. He knows who you are, and he cares. Don't chart a new course for your life until you've talked to God. Don't give up on your job. Don't give up on your marriage. Don't give up on your kids. Don't give in to despair. Why? Because God has a plan for your life. It's a wonderful plan because God loves you. If you will pray, if you will lift up your heart to the Lord, then God will hear your prayer. He will meet your need, and he will change your life forever. God bless you, and God bless America. Amen.